Hello, thank you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for tuning in for another season of the Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight and host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. Quick note, if you are an Insight subscriber, you might have noticed something new in your inbox this morning. We just launched the Insightful Leader newsletter. It's a weekly email focused on leadership insights from our faculty. We're really excited about it, so be sure to check that out. Next month in our live webinar series, we will be hearing from Professor Megan Bussey. She will be speaking to us about climate change and its impact on businesses and how businesses can fight back. Today, of course, Professor Harry Kraemer on leading through tough times. But before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Right now, everyone is using the chat function to tell us where you're from. I love to see it. We are going to shut it down pretty soon, though, so we can focus on your questions, which you will use the Q&A box to send us. You're welcome to upvote other questions that come through that you also want to see the answers to. Closed captioning is available. You can access it via live transcript at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this event is being recorded. Everyone who registered will get a link to the video of this presentation. All right, let's get started. It's no surprise that 2020 and now 2021 have tested leaders in a ton of important ways. So how can you, as a leader, wherever you are in an organization, move forward with empathy, with your values intact, even as everything around you is going haywires? For this, we turn to Harry Kraemer. Harry Kraemer is an executive partner with Madison Dearborn Partners, a private equity firm based in Chicago. He's also a clinical professor of leadership here at Kellogg and the former CEO of Baxter International. He's written 3 best-selling books on leadership, and he is just a nice, thoughtful human whose advice is always welcome. He will start with a quick overview of some of his main points about how leaders should be thinking about their role in this moment. But after each, we will leave time for your questions. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to welcome Harry Kraemer.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where people are calling in from. And it is really, really my pleasure to have the opportunity to spend some time with everybody. And on this topic of how to lead in really, really challenging times, I guess I first start off with really, I hope and pray that all of you and all of your families are safe and healthy during what continues to be a very, very challenging period. And part of this is, as Jessica and I talked about, is literally thinking through as leaders, no matter what level we're at, no matter how sized the organization is, how do we really lead in these times? And what I thought I would do is break this up into several different parts, really 3 parts. One is, how do I lead myself through all of this? Second, how do I lead my teams? And then thirdly, how do I lead up? How do I deal with the CEO of the company? How do we deal with the board? And really dealing with this on all dimensions. And it's clearly been a wild ride. Somebody made the comment on one of my boards the other day. It's a little bit like changing tires when you're going 100 miles an hour. But we're going to go through this. And I really would encourage you, as Jessica said, feel free to raise any questions that we will stop through each of these 3 parts. And I always mention to my students and executives that I have very, very few answers, but I have many opinions, and I'm willing to share my opinions on all these topics. So here we go. The first, and I actually believe the most important, is during these periods of difficulty, how do we really lead ourselves? And if we're honest about it, even when things are going well, it isn't easy. All right, there's a million things to do when we're doing things and things are going relatively well. And when all of a sudden there are big challenges, that just throws additional things on the table. It doesn't take any of the others that we need to do. And one of the things that most of us try to do during these times is we just try to go faster and faster because more and more things are piling up. So let's just keep moving. And I think the difficulty in that is that I think there's a tendency to confuse activity and productivity. Think about that a minute. You know, we're very active, all right? And we've got all these great devices, you know, Blackberries, Blueberries, iPhones. We're moving very quickly. But how productive are we? Or are we moving so fast we don't really even know? And I think the first thing to do in all times, but particularly challenging times, particularly when there's crisis, is to take a little bit of time, you don't have a lot, and take the time to self-reflect. And when I say self-reflect, what that means to me is get away from the noise, get away from the gadgets for a short period of time, and ask yourself what I think are some fairly important questions. Questions like the following: what are my values? What's my purpose? No kidding around. What really matters? How do I want to lead others? What kind of example do I want to set? I'm not capable of thinking about these things when I'm doing 10 other things at the same time, but taking a little bit of time to think about this helps me separate out activity and productivity. It helps me put things together. It puts me in a frame of mind where I can actually make decisions in a rational way. Now, when students or executives say to me, well, what's really the advantage of this? One advantage of this that I often tease folks is that any of you on this call can determine whether somebody else is self-reflective by talking to them for about 5 minutes. And the reason for that is that people that are not self-reflective are constantly surprised, and you're surprised they're surprised. Because if you take a couple minutes to self-reflect, you realize there are bad things that are going to happen. There are difficult periods that are going to happen. So rather than waiting until it occurs, why don't you take the time to think about what are we going to do, not if, when they occur. And there's a series of things that I often mention to executives that happens to all of us that we try not to focus on as much as maybe we ought to be aware that they're there. I put them under the topics of worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, and stress, just to name 5. And what do you know about these things in challenging times? Well, it's not necessarily productive. It uses a lot of energy, and it's clearly not good for your health. But if you wait until you're in the middle of the issue, it's really too late. If I look at Jessica and it turns out she's upset about something, I say, well, Jessica, don't worry. Well, she's already worried. It's really too late. And so what I decided many years ago is that before things run into a challenge, before things become complicated, before there's a crisis, I ask myself, what am I going to do when? Not if. What am I going to do when there's a challenging time? And I decided I would do 2 things. And I highly recommend you think about this or you substitute it for something else. But the 2 things I decided I would always do is, number 1, I, with a lot of people's help, will try to do the right thing. We'll try to do the right thing. Number 2, we will do the best we can do. And again, I'm giving you the summary of this. We talk about this a lot in our MBA classes, a lot in the executive programs. But here we go. If you can convince yourself that no matter what happens, and I mean no matter what happens, I'll try to do the right thing, I'll do the best I can do, I would argue that worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, and stress can be significantly reduced. You can never eliminate them. Welcome to the real world. And we've all had bosses that would say, hey, Jess, a little bit of pressure is not all bad. The problem is we got a lot more than a little bit. And I think your ability to put things into perspective, realize there are things that are going to happen. I can remember many years ago saying, well, geez, this is really going to be tough. There's going to be real challenges. And my grandfather would say to me, Harry, that's why they call it work. That's why we get paid, right? And by the way, Harry, if it was already simple and there wasn't challenging, we may not need you. And I realized, yeah, just putting it in perspective, realizing that I'm not going to waste a lot of time on worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, and stress. Now, before Jessica starts with some questions here, some folks would say, boy, I'm a little surprised that you want to start this whole leadership discussion in challenging times with self-reflection. Well, as an old math major, here's a little 3-step equation, no numbers, a 3-step equation to convince you, as it's convinced me, that everything in leading in challenging times comes down to 3 things. Number 1, if I'm not self-reflective, is it possible for me to know myself? I don't think so. The second part is, if I don't know myself, is it possible for me to lead myself? I don't think so. And the third part is, if I can't figure out how to lead myself, how could I possibly lead other people? So on this journey of dealing with really, really challenging times, if I can first get myself in shape, if I can first get ready, no matter what the issue is, now I'm ready for no matter what happens. And last comment I'll make, Jessica, before we open it up, sometimes at Baxter, where, I had 55,000 team members, I don't use the word employees, but we had 55,000 team members in 103 countries and a lot going on. And sometimes people would say to me, well, geez, Harry, what keeps you awake at night? And I tease people to say, by the time I go to sleep, nothing keeps me awake. And if it looks like I'm not going to go to sleep right away, I'll read another book for a while, or I'll call some people I think that are a lot brighter than I am that can help me figure out how do we deal with this challenge. So this first step, which is very, very important, is the ability to lead myself, to prepare myself then to move on to really leading a team and influencing the whole organization.
I just want to point out that you have kind of some prompts on your website, right? So you can actually read the kind of Harry Kraemer approved self-reflection questions if you're looking for a place to start.
Yeah, in fact, you're right, Jessica. It's all on that website that the Kellogg students set up for me at harrykraemer.org, and I think you've got a lot of them listed on some of the Insight articles as well. But the way I try to think about this, Jessica, on a nightly basis, goes like this. What did I say I was going to do today? What did I actually do? What am I proud of? What am I not proud of? How did I lead people? How did I follow people? If I lived today over again, what would I have done differently? And then the last one, Jessica, a little more philosophical. If I do have tomorrow, and knowing really full well sooner or later I won't, but if I do have tomorrow and I'm a learning person, based on what I learned today, how will I operate differently tomorrow? On whatever dimension of your life has any significance, your work life, your personal life, your spiritual life, whatever really matters to you. And it really does, Jessica, put you in a frame of mind of, okay, back up the truck. What's the next issue? Let's deal with it in a constructive way.
So we did get an interesting question here. As a leader, how can I balance the need to kind of reflect on and work through personal challenges that might be impacting my work with the need to be empathetic to other team members who are going through things and maybe their self-reflection journeys are taking them in a very different direction?
Yeah, so Jessica, it's interesting. I really do, and this is a key piece. I really do believe that one of the things that I need to do as a leader, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the second part, is effectively leading my team through the challenge. And in order to do that, I have to be willing to listen. I have to show them that I truly care about them. But I think also I need to set an example, right? Because if I'm not self-reflective and I'm running around like a lunatic, I really don't think I'm going to be setting a very, very good example. So to demonstrate, Jessica, hey, I know how you feel. I know what you're going through. And I've got a lot of the same challenge. I'm going to share with you the challenges that I have with 5 children, with a lot of things going on. And to demonstrate that I've got issues, I'm vulnerable, I'm listening to you, I think we kind of come together in a much, much better way.
And what would you say to someone who says, that's just another thing on my to-do list? That is one more thing that now it's going to stress me out. Oh, I didn't get my self-reflection in.
Yeah, so this one's a lot of fun, because when I talk about self-reflection and becoming self-aware, Jessica, very often an executive will say to me, well, sounds great, Harry, sounds great. The problem is I just don't have the time. Well, I challenge folks to say, is it we don't have the time, Jessica, or is this something we really don't want to do? And it's interestingly enough, well, if we're talking about leadership, we're willing to challenge ourselves. We're willing to put ourselves out there. And when we say we don't have the time, that's sort of interesting, because, Jessica, most of us take the time to commute someplace during ordinary times. Some people actually try to exercise, walking around the block or getting on an elliptical. And some people actually pray or meditate, right? So is it we don't have the time, or is it something that we really don't want to do? And I think that ability to put things into perspective become important. And I guess I have to give myself a plug for one more thing. When people say we don't have the time, that leads me to that world's most important number, Jessica, which you may or may not recall. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. But 168, it turns out to be that critically important number, okay? Which when people say they don't know, I always say, well, how hard are you working? And they say, well, I'm working 24/7. Well, multiply it out. You have 168 hours, okay? So if you got 168 hours in a week, it's not a question whether you have the time. It's a question of if you prioritize what really is most important. And I would argue, if you don't take the time to lead yourself, if you don't take the time to make sure that you are relating and influencing your team members, in my mind, that's the most important thing. I would actually look at what are the other things you're doing that maybe you could stop doing.
This is an interesting one. Someone wanted to know, how do you leverage your network in the self-reflection process? Is this purely just, Harry, Kraemer, Jess Love sitting at our desks trying to figure out what am I good at? What is my purpose? Or are you actually reaching out for feedback on a regular basis? And should I be doing that more?
Yeah, absolutely, Jessica. Definitely the latter. Again, I was giving you the quick summary, but the very, very important second part, which any of my students online know this, very important that the first step is to spend a little time by yourself. Quickly follow, Jessica, by I've got to reach out to a lot of people to make sure that what I'm saying really makes sense. Or am I fooling myself, right? And often my wife, Julie, will say to me, Kellogg grad will say to me, hey, Harry, left to your own devices, you could convince yourself of anything. Do you want to know what I think? Well, the answer to that question, it better be yes, or I'm in an awful lot of trouble. And I'll role play another example, Jess. If I'm working with you and I say to myself, hey, this is a great lady, she's got good values, I'm going to take the time to sit down with you, maybe over lunch, coffee, and say, hey, Jessica, I want to run something by you. I want to let you know what my values are. I want to let you know what I'm thinking about. And the beauty of that, Jessica, is to get your reaction. And I'll give you the range of reactions I may get from you, okay? And I'll give it to you from the good side to the bad side. From the good side is when you say, hey, Harry, you can stop here. I mean, I've been working with you, and I see your actions every day. Based on your actions, okay, I could have guessed what your values are. I mean, you are literally in sync. Now, the other side, a little more scary, Jessica, is when you say, wow, based on your actions, I'm amazed you think those are your values. You're like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You're like two different people. So getting, as that questioner mentioned, Jessica, getting enough open feedback to say, am I fooling myself? Am I grounded? How does what I'm saying compare to what I'm actually doing? And by the way, that's going to become important in the second part. And one of my guest speakers brought this up, and I don't know where they found it or they made it up themselves, was, somebody made this great comment that it was, people don't care how much you know until they don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. So that ability to truly care about other people, I think, has an enormous impact on your ability to lead in challenging times.
I think we got one more chance for one more question on this kind of leading yourself portion. We are 18, 19 months into this thing, depending on where you are in the world, maybe even more. How are you keeping motivated, and how are you advising others to stay motivated personally?
Yeah, well, the way I think about this, Jess, is when I'm in a difficult period like this, as I said earlier, I'll try to do the right thing. I'll do the best I can, and realizing that no matter what happens, things truly can always be worse. And so when I think about inconveniences I have, I compare that to people that have a lot less. I compare that to people that have lost their job. I compare that to people that are living in a studio apartment with two children that they're trying to get them through school at the same time they're trying to do a Zoom call. So in my mind, when you realize, boy, we're better off than a lot of people, I immediately flip it to, well, how do we help the people that are a lot less fortunate than I am? How do we help people that really need, that care to do it? And then I would say, you got to find ways to keep yourself together. I would say the self-reflection. Maybe for somebody, prayer and meditation. I'm a great believer in you got to get at least a half an hour, 45-minute of exercise every day, right? Often one of the articles that we use in class, Jessica, is called the corporate athlete, because everybody on this call is in no way running a sprint. We're running a marathon. And if you're running a marathon, you got to pace yourself. And a lot of us on this call, if you remember what it was like when you were an athlete or, you were in sports, what did the coach tell you? Take care of yourself, pace yourself, don't eat a lot of junk, get some rest. And in this great article, Jim really talks about really 4 dimensions of needing to care for yourself. I think he refers to just the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And that ability to put that into perspective, I think becomes critically important. It's all about pacing. It's all about pacing. I always tease. I keep thinking I graduated from Kellogg a couple of years ago, and my wife says, "Harry, no, it was 42 years ago." And I said, "Julie, we don't need to be that direct, okay? Since I'm only 39 years old." But that ability, and I'm praying that I'll be able to teach the next 20 years. So pacing yourself, putting things into perspective, not allowing worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, and stress to overtake you, I think becomes really important on this leadership journey.
All right. I would like to usher us on to the kind of leading teams and organizations part of this chat. We're already getting some good questions around that portion, but I want to make sure you get a chance to say your piece first, and then we'll launch into those.
Sure, and I know we've already said a couple things about this, but this one becomes really key. So now I'm prepared. I mean, I'm really now prepared to start to be able to lead myself. So what could possibly be more important now than really helping my team get through this? And I start off with a very simple model again, 3 words. You can write them right underneath one another: leadership, influence, relate. Leadership, influence, relate. And by that I mean, as you well know, Jess, leadership has nothing to do with titles and organizational charts. Leadership has everything to do with the ability to influence people. And the only way I know how to influence people is the ability to relate to people. And if we had the time, Jess, you and I could spend an hour talking about that one word, that ability to relate, okay? If I can relate, I can have an enormous impact. And how do I relate? Well, first of all, I listen to people, right? We've all heard that expression. There's a reason that we've got, 2 ears and 1 mouth. Really listening to people, showing that you care, really wanting to make sure that you understand people's views, to the point where, Jess, as we all know, many people have very, very strong opinions. The problem I find is very rarely that they understand the opinions and the perspectives of anybody other than themselves. And I literally talk about, after self-reflection, this very important principle of having a balanced perspective. All right. And what does that mean? It means taking the time to truly understand all sides of the story. And I quote again, which I'm not sure, among others, I think it could be St. Francis, who said, "I seek to understand before I'm understood." I try to train myself, Jessica, if I'm talking to you, I will try to never say, "Jess, I don't understand where you're coming from," because I really believe that really is ignorant. If I take the time, I can understand where you're coming from. Then I'll decide, do I agree or disagree? And I may disagree, but that doesn't mean I dislike you. That doesn't mean you're the enemy. Just a little bit of the polarization we've got going on right now. But I truly care, and I want to know what you think. And I'll also let you know, if you're on my team, that, Jess, I want to know what you think. And by the way, if what you think makes more sense than what I thought I was going to do, I'm just going to say, Jess, forget what I said. Let's do that, because, among other things, I have no need to be right. I'm fanatically focused on trying to do the right thing. And so I'm going to encourage you to challenge me. I'm going to encourage you to feel, boy, this guy really cares about me. He cares about me in a very, very big way. So now, Jess, when we talk about and just drill into this a little bit of how good, everybody on this line, how good are you in your ability to relate? And the way I play this with my students is I'll ask them, well, how many of you want to be a leader? And then, people raise their hand. And I'll say, well, how many of you think you relate well to people? And people raise their hand. And I'll say, all right, now this time, don't raise your hand. I don't want to embarrass anybody. How many of you know the name of the receptionist when you walk in the building? How many of you, when you go in the cafeteria, know the names of everybody and how many children they have? And when you talk to the maintenance folks, do you know their favorite sport team? Do you thank them for everything that they're doing, right? Why? Because you realize every single person matters. And the reason I refer to genuine humility, because at the end of the day, a lot of people act like everybody's important, but they actually don't believe it. They don't actually practice it on a day-to-day basis. And I think that ability to relate now, let's talk about this ability to relate in really challenging times. I get this a lot, maybe you do, Jessica, that, in a lot of teams right now, you don't get a chance to see your team members, right, live. And we're on Zoom. And a lot of people, the time they get on Zoom is they got 10 people on their team, and okay, let's have a Zoom call. How are sales? What's happening to earnings? What's going on? I would encourage people, if you have a team of 10, I would call every single one of those people one-on-one. And the one-on-one discussion doesn't talk about what's happening to sales this week. It's, Jess, how are you doing? How's your family? Okay, I think you said you had an elderly aunt you were taking care of. My goodness, can you even visit her right now? How are your children? Don't you have a first and third grader? What's that like? And by the way, is there anything I can do to help you? And if I can demonstrate, this is way beyond words. If I can demonstrate I care about you as much as I care about myself, that'll create an environment where you can relate, you can influence, and you can lead. And taking the time, some people say, well, boy, that would take a lot of time. Well, I always tell people, if you've got the right people and every single person knows you care about them, they'll do anything for you. They'll do anything for you. And so I always think of this as this magical combination of win-win. It's the right values thing to do, that's for sure. But even if that light didn't go on, you would still do that because that's how you build teams. That's how you build a scenario that people really feel that they're part of things. And so that ability to continue to do that whether things are going well, and I would argue, Jess, when things aren't going well, you need to communicate, as you well know, 2 or 3 times as often. And you see these organizations, and some of you may have worked for them, that when things are going well, you get a note from the CEO and the president all the time. And as soon as there's a crisis, all of a sudden people have disappeared. And I always argue when things aren't going well, you really need to turn up the communication volume. And of course, the pushback I sometimes get from CEOs, they'll say, well, but Harry, there's a lot of things we don't know, and I don't think I want to admit what we don't know. Which gets me, Jess, before we open it up for additional questions, it gets me to the point where let's go through, I would say, a couple of steps of what to do in your communication with your team, whether you're close by, whether you're scattered around the world, whether you can't see people. Here's 3 steps to deal with in a challenging time, in a time of crisis. 3 simple steps. Number 1, you tell people, Jess, what you know. You don't lie to them. You don't make it up. You don't wing it. You say, this is what we know right now, okay? Number 2, here's what we don't know. Here's why we don't know it. We're going to show vulnerability. We're not going to have a big ego. We're not going to be a narcissist. Here's what we don't know and why we don't know it. But step number 3, here's the process to continuously update you on what we don't know, right? And that may be every day. It may be every week. And your reaction to that, Jess, is probably going to be, you know what? Harry's showing vulnerability. I trust him. This guy's got no personal agenda other than to help me and this organization better, right? So let's get real practical. Having been in healthcare for 40 years, let's talk about a real touchy subject. Let's talk about the current pandemic, okay? What do we know? Well, talking to a lot of people in a lot of companies and the CDC, NIH, what do we know? We have a pandemic, okay? What do we know? This has hurt a lot of people, okay? We've got almost 5 million people around the world that have passed away. Over 600,000 Americans have passed away. We got a pandemic, okay? Now, what don't we know? Well, I don't think we really know how long this is going to last. I don't think we really know whether, 2 shots are going to do it. I don't know if we know whether a booster will really be required. I don't know if we know is something going to happen after the Delta variant and whether something else is going to happen. We don't know that by taking the vaccine, are there some long-term implications 30 years? We don't know, okay? But you know what? Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and we're going to continue to study this. We're going to continue to do projects. We're going to continue to do more testing, all right? And the way I look at it, when the glass is half full rather than half empty, I am a pretty strong believer is that I don't believe this is going to be 1918 all over again, okay? I believe that lasted something like 6 or 7 years and resulted in 35 million people dying, okay? We're sort of blessed and fortunate to be living in 2021. I will tell you how fast these vaccines were created, in my mind, is a miracle of all. Now, we've got challenges. We've got a lot of different people that are looking at this in a different way. But in my mind, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how quickly we'll continue to update folks. And showing people that we care, showing people that we really understand what they're going through and how hard this is, how difficult it is. But reaching out, continuously communicating, demonstrating how much you care, in my mind, has an enormous impact. Because what you're really doing is you're treating every person exactly the way you'd like to be treated, right? And sometimes in these classes, Jess, people say, well, this seems awful simple. It is simple. Someone say, well, is it common sense? And this is when I can ever help myself from quoting one of my very favorite quotes from Mark Twain, who many years ago said, if you stop and think about it, Jess, everything is common sense. The problem, the big problem, is that common sense is not common. So here we go.
Well, we've got some great questions that have been coming in. This one's really popular. I love it. Do you think that the actual role of being a leader has changed during the pandemic?
Boy, great question. Great question. Well, thank goodness. Thank goodness. I always say opinion rather than answer. I guess the way I think about this one, and the person who asked the question, they can challenge me on this if they want, Jessica. I actually think that the requirements to be a leader, okay, have always remained pretty constant. It's leading yourself, leading others, communicating like crazy, listening carefully, demonstrating you care. I think that's always been important. But what the question reminds me of, and it's a great question, is I would argue what this needs to do in this period is really turning up the volume. Okay, if you thought under ordinary times, hey, I'm going to check in with Jessica once in a while. During these times, I'm going to check in with Jessica every other day. Okay, because she may not want to admit how hard this is. She may not want to admit what she's going through if the person seems to be dealing with an elderly relative or maybe a single parent or whatever the situation. So I would say the leadership requirements are a pretty clear rule book, but during a challenging time, during a crisis, you got to pump it up a lot more and spend the great majority of your time. And I'll come back to something you mentioned earlier, Jessica, when this topic comes up of, well, I don't have the time. Here's something I tell executives that may sound like an exaggeration, but in a leadership role, I would argue once the strategy is set, and once you know where you're trying to take the organization, I would argue most of your time, Jessica, is on one of two things. It's either on the word people, I'll come back to that in a minute, or the word communication, which I know you're an expert in, okay? Let's take the two words. When I say the word people stands for attracting, recruiting, hiring, developing, giving open, honest, continuous feedback retentions. It's all about getting the right people. The second one is communication. And the communication word stands for creating an environment that every single person understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, how they fit in, and Jess, you've created an environment where it's not just okay for people to challenge, you require them to challenge. And if I have a little formula here, people plus communication, for me, is at least 90% of my time. And I always have fun with executives, Jessica, because somebody will usually say, well, wait a minute, Harry, you said we could challenge you. If you're spending 90% of your time on people and communication, I mean, when do you get work done? And of course, I have to always remind people the famous two-letter English word if. If I've got all the right people, not 50%, if I've got all the right people, and if everybody knows exactly what to do, well, what else is there to do, right? And so that in my mind paints the picture in a way that becomes much easier to lead in a very, very challenging time.
I love that final bit of advice. You mentioned earlier you have 30 plus years of experience in healthcare, and we have gotten a number of questions whether you have advice specifically for people leading in the healthcare environment right now. So I think this is a group that has had an even more challenging 18 months than many others. It's just a prolonged stretch of intense challenges for teams. And any advice for leaders in that environment?
Yeah, I'll tell you, if I spend more time praying for one group more than others, it's every single person in the healthcare field that are in hospitals, in healthcare centers, that really are risking their life 24/7 to take care of people that are in dire need. And I'll give you a good example, not to embarrass a person, but I'll give you a great example of the way I think it should be handled. For many years, I've been on the board of North Shore University Health System that's based in Evanston, but has a whole collection of healthcare services all throughout Chicago. And the fellow who is a leader and is a guest speaker in a lot of my classes, Jessica, is J.P. Gallagher, the CEO. Every time I'm at that hospital, and he and I are walking down the halls, he literally says hello, and I believe he knows the name of every person there, whether they're the receptionist, the nurses, the maintenance folks, the nurses coming in and out, and literally saying, hey, Joe, how are you doing? Hey, Debbie, what's going on? Is there anything we can be doing for you? And I really believe that when people literally know how much you care, I think it has an enormous impact. And then literally trying to think through, hey, what can we do to give some people some time off? What can we do? And how can we adjust the schedules so people can just have some downtime to be able to spend a little bit more time with their family? And so appreciating people. And again, so much of this, I think, gets confused, Jess, because a lot of times it's like, oh, well, we'll pay people more money. Well, you know what? Motivation is one small part money, but it's an awful lot about feeling cared for, feeling appreciated, feeling respected. And I think some of the folks that are working in healthcare now are an unbelievable group of people that, if you think about the United States, the death toll would have been a heck of a lot higher if we didn't have the number of people in healthcare that are doing what they're doing every day.
I got one more question for you, and then I'm going to move on to kind of managing up. I want to make sure we have time for that. A lot of people had this question. I think humility is a key trait in good leaders. I think you'll agree with this, Harry. Any advice for how to display humility while still commanding respect and authority?
Yeah, boy, I'm smiling because this is sort of like right out of my class. So let me kind of summarize this in a way that gets right at this. So I often talk about in the classes and in the books, Jess, that, as you well know, that everything comes down to these four principles. And we talked a lot about self-reflection. We talked quite a bit about balance. The third one is true self-confidence. And the fourth one is genuine humility. And that third and fourth really kind of fit together, because when I say true self-confidence, people say, well, what's the true? And I remind people that true self-confidence means you're kind of comfortable in your own skin. You know you're good. You're not great. You're going to get a lot better, okay? And when people say, well, how do you know if you have true self-confidence? Are you willing to admit what you don't know? Are you willing to admit that when you were wrong? So you know you're good and you have true self-confidence, but at the same time, I would double underline it, at the same time, I have enough genuine humility to realize every single person matters. So this is not a thing where some students will say, well, maybe I need less humility and more self-confidence. No, I actually believe you want more of both. It's sort of like, if you're my boss, Jess, beyond words, you're going to know, Jess, with the right team of people, I can get anything done. At the same time, it's not about me. It's about this team. And anybody out there that wants to know, here's a good self-reflection question. Anybody wants to know, well, how do I have genuine humility? Do I really have it? Well, here's two questions that help you, Jess, figure out whether you have genuine humility. And if people on your team you want to assess, great question. Here's the question. We got a lot of very successful people from all over the world on this call. How did you get to where you are so far? How did you get to where you are so far? The two top responses, Jess, regardless of the country asked the question and regardless of the tenure of the person, the age, two answers are, well, I work very hard and I have certain skill sets. And working hard in skill sets, that's how I got to where I am. Well, if you ask me that question quickly, well, I worked hard, I have certain skill sets. But if you're self-reflective, I'll give you 5 things that have impacted my career, okay? I put working hard and skill sets at the bottom of the list. Here's 5 I'd give. How about luck? How about timing? How about the team? If it wasn't for the teams, I never would have accomplished what I did. Luck, timing, the teams. How about mentors? How about sponsors? How about the people, in my case, like Dean Jacobs, that if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have the opportunities I had at Baxter. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to come back and teach at Kellogg. And then the fifth one, for some of us, it's a little bit more personal. For some of us, there's a religious, spiritual component. But if any of those work, a realization of luck, timing, the team, mentors, religious perspective, if any of those work, I think suddenly people start to realize, I'll never forget where I came from. Most of us start off with very little. I'll keep things in perspective. At Baxter, we used to say, you don't read your own press clippings, or if you do read them, you don't necessarily believe them. And the fourth one, and this one's critical, Jessica, the higher you go up in an organization, there better be a few people who knew you before you became a big shot. Because on the way to becoming a big shot, there will be people, I will guarantee you, that are going to start to say, Harry, you're amazing. Harry, you're remarkable. If Harry's not careful, Harry will start to believe it. Why is that a problem? Well, if the model is leadership, influence, relate, most people, Jessica, as you know, will not relate well to egomaniacs. They will not relate well to people where it's all about them. So that ability to put things into perspective, lead myself, some true self-confidence, and a little genuine humility. I'll be vulnerable. People can relate to me, and I think it'll make an enormous difference.
Great. You're actually answering questions without even knowing it as so very good. And maybe it was one of your former students that planted that humility question, but I doubt it. I think that's a pretty popular one. So I want to make sure we have a chance to get to leading up, but don't worry, we'll have time at the very end to continue to ask some of the general Q&A. So go for it, Harry. Managing up, what do we need to do?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're on our journey, because by the way, leadership isn't a destination, it's a journey. We're on our journey. We're starting to be able to lead ourselves. We're doing a better job of leading our teams. Well, now we got to figure out, how do we influence the whole organization? And a lot of people don't talk about this a lot, Jess, but there's this whole field of topic in my mind of how do you lead up? What do you do when all the things we've talked about, we get it, we understand it, but our boss, he or she either doesn't get it, doesn't want to get it, or maybe, maybe they're just not a great person. I don't know. I mean, maybe they had the wrong parents. I mean, something just went wrong, right? Well, how do you deal with that? Okay. It all fits in my mind on that ability to lead, influence, relate. So if I role play this again, I'm just making this up, Jessica, because you are a good person. But let's just say you're my boss, and you're very difficult. All right. Well, I've got to figure out a way to be able to relate to you so I can change your mind. I can change the direction. And maybe what I will do is I will take the time to understand how you operate, what works, what doesn't work. And it may turn out that, I'll just make it up, maybe you have just a big ego. Maybe you don't like to listen to somebody at a lower level. Well, guess what? I will not let my ego get in the way. If I can come up with something, I'll let it be your idea. I'll let you take the credit for it. Or if it turns out, and this happens a lot, that there's just no way I'm going to get you to listen to me, I know you well enough to know you will listen to somebody at your level. And there is somebody, maybe it's Joanne, who works with you, who went to school with you, who does influence you. Well, guess what? I'll sit down and talk with Joanne and say, Joanne, I got this idea. It's different than Jess. Does this make sense? And she said, Harry, I think it makes sense. You know what? Don't get involved. Let me take the ball. I'll talk to Jess. So in other words, I'll use whatever vehicle I need to figure out a way to be able to influence you. All right? Because I can't wait for somebody else. And a lot of my classes, as you know, Jess, when you and I are sitting in a cubicle and we're looking at people up there and we just don't know how to get it done. And we say, well, somebody needs to do something about it. And often I'll tease the students that there seems to be this magical group of people that we think is going to do something about it. And they're usually referred to as those guys. I don't know who they are, but some magical group of men or women, gender neutral term here. And I realize, well, wait a minute. If we're leaders, we are those guys. We are the men or women who ought to do something about it. So I need to be careful how I do it, but I'll do that. And by the way, this also is true now if I'm dealing with the board. All right. And if I happen to be running the company, and many of you that if you happen to be running a company or soon day will, you've got to be able to deal with the board. And often, a lot of times, when somebody's about ready to become the CEO, I will tease them and I'll say, well, you think now it's going to be all about you. You think now you're going to be leading. But by the way, for the first time in your life, instead of having one boss who usually knows your job, you now wake up and you're going to have 12 bosses, none of whom have been in your job, and many of them have never been in your company. But guess what? They're now your boss. So figuring out how you're going to relate to these people, how you're going to work with these people. And what I try to encourage leaders at all levels in terms of dealing with a CEO or dealing with a board, here's another little 4-step model. Where do things usually go wrong? I think it's because you make assumptions, because some people on a board make the mistake of thinking they're running the company. And in my corporate governance class, I always tease folks, I have a big line. There's a big difference between management and governance. The board governs, management manages. And as long as that's very clear, we're going to be fine. But very, very often, you'll have a situation where the board thinks they're involved in management, or the management is so weak that they let the board start to manage. And I think a great way to deal with this is another little 4-step model that I use, and it goes like this. We're not going to make any assumptions. No assumptions. Step 1, we set a clear expectation. What's the role of management? What's the role of the board? let's get agreement on that setting that expectation, number one. Number two, we will communicate that expectation over and over and over again. As you know from your work in communications, Jess, the average person needs to hear something 3 times before they've heard it. Julie tells me until she's told me something 10 times, I haven't heard it, but that's my own personal problem, right? Number 3, we will hold one another accountable. And number 4, there's consequences, both positive and negative. And I would argue whatever you're doing, whoever you're dealing with, if you can figure out a way to set clear expectations, thoroughly communicate them, hold one another accountable, and there's consequences, you can remove a tremendous amount of all the cha-cha and really, really be able to get things done. And I really do believe once you start to do that, you have an enormous impact. And maybe the other thing at that level that becomes important, whether you're running the organization, whether you're a C-level person, whether you're on the board, let's face it, you've got a lot of stakeholders to deal with, right? You've got the members of the team, you've got suppliers, customers, shareholders, society, the government, maybe the world overall if you're a global company. And that can actually become overwhelming, again, if you're not self-reflective enough to say, how am I going to handle all this stuff? We talked about it in the first section. I'll try to do the right thing. I'll do the best I can do. And it's a balance. Everything in my mind is a balance. And I think at very top levels, if you don't understand that balance, you get yourself in a lot of trouble, right? Are we going to focus on the short term or the long term? I think it's yes. Are we going to focus on growth or return? Yes. Are we going to create as much flexibility for people as possible? Or do we need to have at some point in time people actually coming to get together live so we can grow people and build a culture? I think the answer is yes. But if we end up in this polarized world where it's either one thing or the other, very, very difficult to get anything done. And so that ability to lead up, the ability to influence in a respectful way, I think has an enormous impact on whether or not you're able to get things done with not just yourself and your team, but with the CEO, the executive team, and the board. We could talk about this a lot, but I want to make sure we got a lot of time for questions here.
Well, I had a follow-up because really it sounds like a real important value to you is just transparency and trust. And it kind of struck me, your idea of kind of getting Joanne to go to the CEO and maybe be the person to influence on your behalf. How do you kind of reconcile that desire to, maybe not be fully transparent in all situations with, with your other core values?
Yeah, well, you asked a great question, Jess. So this one's kind of fun for me because I would say I want to be as transparent as possible. And again, in that little scenario we gave, I will try everything I can. Here's sort of the outline, Jess. I'm going to try everything I can myself to influence you. I'll try everything I can. Now, after I've tried that and I can't get through to you, I've got 2 choices, Jess. I can either say, oh, I can't do it, I'm going to go away, or say, well, wait a minute. No, I can't stop here. I've got to figure out what other vehicles I can use. Which, by the way, in a way, Jess, this does border on an interesting one where somebody said to me, well, geez, I know what it was. My grandfather, again, who lived with us, a lot of influence. One of the things that he used to say to me when I was a younger guy, actually, even when I was in college, he used to say, Harry, you never want to be political. Harry, you never want to be political because if you're political, Harry, you can't look at yourself in the mirror and feel good about it. Then he kind of smiled, he got the little Irish look in his eye, and he said, however, you better be politically sensitive or you will not be alive to look in the mirror. So once again, Jess, it's a balance. It's a balance. Yes, I want to be transparent. Yes, I want to do what I can. But if I can't do it that way, and this is important, you're about to do something that I think really doesn't make sense, I better find another way to do it. Or how can I say that I'm a leader, right? In fact, it's a little bit like this, Jess, when somebody says, well, I've got my values. I know it's important, but you know what? This company I'm realizing now isn't consistent with my values. Well, should I leave? Well, my perspective is, have you done everything you can to lead up to try to change? Now, if you have, okay, I'm not a big Don Quixote fan, okay, then I probably better leave, okay? But have I really tried? Because if I haven't really tried, maybe Jess, as my boss, maybe you're doing stuff because you didn't know any better. Nobody told you that it didn't make any sense. And I have found when I have challenged leaders in the past, the number of times they'll say, well, you know what, Harry, I wasn't aware of that. I didn't know I was giving off that impression. I didn't realize that I was sucking all the oxygen out of the room and not listening to anybody. So I love to give people the benefit of the doubt until I realize they know what they're doing and they don't care. And then I've got to do something about it.
Got a few more really interesting questions for you. This is a hard one. As a leader, how can I make really difficult decisions like restructuring a team or laying people off, and then explain to the new team that they are safe and I care about them?
Yeah, boy, oh boy, I tell you, these questions are fantastic. Okay, I love it. So here's the thought on this one. And this one, I'm going to get real practical for whoever asked this one, because I want to go back to my little model of setting clear expectations, communicating, holding one another accountable, and there's consequences, positive, negative. I have seen the mistake, my opinion, many general managers make, where when they're visiting a facility and somebody asks them, well, will there ever be a layoff? Oh, no, there's not going to be a layoff. Okay, there's not going to be a layoff. Well, the reality of life is, why don't I, and I'm going to use you, Jessica, as the person asking the question, I look at it as, I'm going to treat you exactly the way I'd like to be treated. So what I would say, and I've done this in many, many facilities and many different scenarios, I would say, great question. I hope we don't have a layoff. I like to do what we can, but you know what, Jess, it could happen. And at some point in time, if it does happen, let me tell you what will occur. We will try to find you another job. We will help you with outplacement. We will make sure that there's severance. I will treat you the way I would like to be treated, but and by the way, here are the 5 reasons why it may not happen. But by the way, if competitors figure out a way to cut their price by 50%, if they come up with a better product than we have, well, you know what? That'll be an issue. So I'm going to be open. I'm going to be honest. And by the way, for all of you that have ever have to lay off people, in my mind, that was one of the very toughest things I ever had to do. But I convinced myself early on 2 things. One, I'm going to let people know that I cannot hire you, Jess, for life, okay? But I can't guarantee you life employment, but I can guarantee you 2 things. One, I'll help you develop every day you're at the organization. And if you're no longer at the organization, I'll help you find another job someplace else. We will do the best outplacement we possibly can. I was always a great believer at Baxter that we would literally take the time to figure out, on average, how many weeks did it take to find the person another job. And by the way, as difficult as it was, I always said to myself, well, if I've got 100 people, and right now we can no longer afford to do that, I really have 2 choices. I can either lay off 10 people and help them find another job and work with another 90 people to be successful, or I can say, well, we're not going to let anybody lay off anybody, and then I run the risk of the entire organization going bankrupt. So once again, it's a balance. All of this is a balance to treat people, in my mind, exactly the way I'd like to be treated.
That's awesome. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit here. Can you share tips for leading really unmotivated people?
Oh boy. Okay, sure. Well, we could do a whole segment, Jessica, sometime on feedback. I mean, this is a huge topic. And the way I describe this is, again, I use you, Jessica. If you work for me, I have a moral obligation, not just what it's nice to do. I have a moral obligation to develop you to your full potential. I have a moral obligation to let you know in a respectful way, Jessica, here's what you do well, and here's what you don't do well. Okay? I'm going to treat you the way I like to be treated. I say that to myself 100 times a day. And part of the process is I'm going to let you know that, you know what, Jess? Let's talk about the things that are going to need to improve for you to stay in the job you're in. And let's talk about what you'd like to do in the future. And I'll let you know what that would take to get there. But if you're unmotivated, I'm going to probably have an open discussion to say, you know, Jessica, if it does matter, Jessica, here's my perspective. Here's what I see is happening. Here's what you need to do. Now, I'm going to work with you. But if these things don't change, that's going to have an impact on your career. Somebody said to me one time, Jessica, executive said to me, well, how do you know if you're good at feedback? How do you know? And I said, well, you know what? It's actually pretty easy. If you're good at feedback, you will never surprise somebody. Okay. And if all the people I had to leave Baxter and several of the boards I'm on, very rarely did I surprise anybody. In fact, most of the time you'd come up to me, because this is not this once a year piece of paper, okay? This is on an ongoing weekly basis. Hey, Jess, here's what's going well, here's what's not going well. And very often you'd come up to me and saying, Harry, you kept mentioning this motivating thing. This isn't working, is it? Jess, it isn't. And I don't know if this company's a good fit for you. We'll see if there's something else. Maybe Baxter's too large. Maybe you shouldn't be working in a global company. Maybe you shouldn't be in a healthcare company. But to have people that are unmotivated in the organization, I think is something that is significantly harmful to not just you, but to the entire organization.
Another people management question. These are real popular today. How do you deal with people who turn everything into a crisis?
So the way they taught us this at Baxter that may be helpful, because I love to give people little practical tips, Jess. Here's a little rule book that we can give people. And it was one of my early bosses who literally put 10 of us in a room. I always say I went to Baxter for 2 years as a junior analyst and forgot to leave and was there for 25 years. Never dreaming I'd be the CFO or the CEO. But the way he put this in the room, he said, I'll tell you what, gang, I want to be very open. I want to be very transparent, but let's establish the rule book. And you can just jot this down. Rule number 1, every problem or issue you bring to my attention, everything that you think is a crisis, you bring to my attention, you receive 1 full point. So I'm not going to dissuade you from doing that. And if you want to tell me what the problems are, don't surprise me and let them know. But that's rule number 1. You get 1 point for every problem or crisis you bring up. Rule number 2, Jess, every solution you bring to my attention, you receive 1,000 points. Now, for those of you on this call that are into math, think about where we could be headed here, right? Because there's only 1 more rule, which is rule number 3. He or she with the most points wins. So, Jess, if you were my boss, that was the last day I ever brought an issue to you without at least 1 solution. Now, if there's an issue, I'm going to let you know. I'm never going to surprise you. And maybe I don't have a solution. But I was actually known at Baxter as the 3 solution guy. I'm going for 3,000 points every time. All right. So you're encouraging people to say, okay, well, thank you, Madeline, for telling me it's an issue. What are we going to do about it? What do you think I should do about it? And there's the feedback again. Okay. I can't just have you running around giving me problems or issues. But once you know what the rule book is, all right, if you're not picking up a couple 1,000-point solutions once in a while, you're probably not going to be in the organization. So that again, setting a clear expectation, communicating, holding people accountable, and there's consequences.
All right, we are almost at time. This is the last question. It's super important, but try to be brief. Okay. Is that a Bruce Springsteen poster behind you, and what is its significance?
Well, funny you should mention, okay? Yes, it is. And you know what? If you go to 25 concerts, your wife will let you buy one of these things. So, and I was just in New York 2 weeks ago to see his one-man show.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. We're ending with the most inspirational advice. Well, thank you, everyone. We are at time. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I really loved the questions today. A huge thank you to Harry Kraemer. It is always a pleasure to chat with you. We will send the audience a link to a video of this presentation in the next day or two. And of course, look out for an invitation to next month's webinar with Megan Bussey on the business of climate change. That will be October 28th at noon. Thank you so much.